Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullaha haqqa tuqatih wa la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear Muslim brothers and sisters in Islam, I'm going to get right into it, inshallah ta'ala. This is my attempt to do a reaction video to Piers Morgan's uncensored interview that he conducted with Dr. Abdul Wahid as his guest yesterday. Now, before I get into the thick of it, I want to just make a point which I think is quite important to bear in mind and remember, that before he brought Dr. Abdul Wahid onto the show, he had a bunch of other guests on there, and they were talking about British politicians, accountability, freedom of speech, and so on and so forth, as if this is all some fantastic great thing, whilst at the same time complaining about their politicians. So this, to keep this in mind as we go through the rest of this video, inshallah ta'ala. So the first thing I want to mention is it was very, very clear right from the beginning that Piers Morgan was not planning to conduct this interview in a fair, balanced way. Right from his opening statement, you could see that he was intending to make this interview very, very one-sided and to serve an agenda that had already been set. Now, we already knew that, but what do I mean? Brothers who have seen Mohammed Hijab give his interviews on Piers Morgan will recall that he was introduced by Piers Morgan as an individual who has got quite a controversial status amongst people. Now, Mohammed Hijab rightly so contested Piers Morgan on that introduction, and Piers Morgan did exactly the same thing with Brother Abdul Wahid, introduced him as, you know, an individual who's got a less than wholesome second life, almost to set the tone for the interview, to implant this seed in the mind of the viewers that Dr. Abdul Wahid, on the one hand, he's got a nice likable face as a NHS doctor, but behind the scenes he's some dodgy person. He's got some seedy aspect to his character. He lives in a deep, dark underworld, secrets about him that haven't been revealed yet. We need to be careful about this man. This is how the introduction came across, and you know, this is not the sign of a journalist who is approaching an interview with fairness and balance. So that's the first point. So getting into the actual interview, he talked about jihad, and he played a video clip of a protest in London that had taken place a few weeks ago, where the attendees were shouting jihad, 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 jihad. And he asked Brother Abdul Wahid a very, very simple question: is it acceptable for people in the streets of London to be chanting jihad? Again, there is a significant degree of bias which will go missed if we do not follow this individual's previous interviews with Israeli supporters, pro-Zionists, and so on and so forth. I don't recall, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I don't recall any of those such guests being asked, is it acceptable that pro-Israeli supporters protesting and demonstrating in the streets of London or New York or anywhere else to be chanting Nakaba, 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 in the same way the British government wants to make this chant, free, free Palestine from the river to the sea, illegal? All right, what about Nakaba, 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 Nakaba? So straight off, there's a double standard there. And similarly asking any of his pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist guests whether it's acceptable to see or condone any chanting on the streets of London where people are saying death to the Arabs, death to Muslims, Muhammad is X, Y, and Z. Okay, Zionist Israeli supporters making some exceptionally derogatory remarks about our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the streets of London, in the streets of New York and elsewhere. He hasn't once asked a question like that. Okay, so he asks the question whether it's acceptable for people to be shouting and chanting jihad, 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 because he considers it, as does every other politician in the West, as an incitement to violence. And not just that, even more abhorrent for them in their eyes is an incitement to a holy war. It's okay for a Western ruler like George W. Bush, okay, 20 odd years ago, to say that we are going to war, okay, that I am a war president, to glorify the fact that he was responsible for killing thousands upon thousands upon thousands of innocent men, women and children in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's okay for him to laud at that and to be self-gratifying in front of the world media, okay, but it's not okay for somebody to chant jihad in a protest where 99% of the people who are demonstrating are Muslims. He wants to somehow suggest that there is no equivocation or equivalence, let's say, between the term jihad and the term, we're at war with these people, when they say that at the West, that the two things are completely worlds apart, whereas in actual fact they're not. And this is what Brother Abdul Wahid said, is that when people chant for jihad, they're calling for military intervention. And Piers Morgan, towards the end of the show, said he understands Sharia law. Like, it clearly doesn't, because he doesn't understand what the term jihad means, right? Okay, it means exactly that. If the Israelis are going to take up weapons and arms, okay, and they can call it whatever they want, okay, war, kibbutz, or whatever they want to call their military action, okay, then, if you're going to be fair and unbiased, at least say, I assume jihad, I understand why people are calling for that. I understand what it means, but clearly, and you do understand what it means, but clearly you are trying to set a narrative during the whole of the interview to make out that there is a terrorist or a terrorist sympathizer within the ranks of the British National Health Service. That was what you were seeking to achieve from that interview. Okay. The interview then progressed, and he kept referring to Hamas as a terrorist organization. I think people have forgotten that Hamas won an election. Okay, the fact that the West didn't like the outcome, the fact that the West didn't see the result that they were expecting, i.e. that their puppet Palestinian Authority, which is an offshoot of the PLO, they were expecting them to win, they were somehow didn't like the outcome of the election, and they say, oh, it's rigged, or therefore we don't recognize Hamas as a legitimate government, therefore they are a terrorist movement. Okay, and any military wing of Hamas's government is a terrorist organization. So by that de facto, Israel being an illegal occupier of the Palestinian lands, the IDF being its military wing, similarly must be a terrorist movement. At least exercise a degree of balance in the way that you're conducting your interview. And on the subject of terrorist movements, I recall not that long ago, the PLO, Yasser Arafat, was considered to be a terrorist movement. I remember not that long ago, the IRA was considered to be the military wing of Sinn Féin, a terrorist movement. But now you've done a deal with the devil, didn't you? The Good Friday Agreement. So nobody ever talks about Sinn Féin or IRA as being a terrorist organization. And this leads nicely onto the next topic that was raised, and that was the comparison that Piers Morgan was trying to draw between the legitimacy of the people of Ukraine rising up and rebelling against Russia, and somehow saying that there is no comparison between that and what the Muslims in the Palestinian lands have. I.e., he was suggesting that the Muslims in the Palestinian lands do not have the same legal premise, the ethical premise, or the moral premise as the Ukrainians, because Ukraine was illegally invaded by Russia. You need to either study your history, okay, or be sincere when you conduct your interviews. Because if we look at the Palestinian issue, okay, the Palestinian problem, it goes back from 1917. 1917, you know, just as everybody else on your show, okay, that the Palestinian lands were under the authority of the Ottoman Caliphate, and the British illegally occupied the Palestinian lands, and through that you found the Israeli state emerging. So the Israeli state was established on a plot of land that was illegally occupied by Britain, and so the right of self-defense, the right of taking military arms up against an illegal occupier existed legally, ethically, and morally from 1917 until now. So if you want to claim that any organization or any individual who takes up arms and fights any institution of the Israeli state is a terrorist, okay, then you have to use that same measure and classify the Ukrainian soldiers, the Ukrainian freedom fighters as terrorists as well, because the legality, the ethics of it, the morals of both of these cases is exactly the same. But we know that you're going to have your double standards, and those double standards are never going to go away. When the British were occupying the whole of Ireland, everybody knows that history. What happened? There were people who were illegally occupied by the British, okay, and they wanted to rise up against them. This was even before the IRA, okay. This was when the whole of Ireland was looking to kick the British out, because they acknowledged that they were illegally occupied, that the British forces, okay, had colonized and occupied that land in its entirety. So are you then now in 2023 say that the Irish had no legal, ethical, or moral grounds to fight against the British? If you say that they didn't, it is an absolute travesty and a shame upon you. From this point, I want to diverge a little bit on the subject of terrorist movements to extremism. I don't know which side of the political spectrum you are on currently, okay, but not that long after the First World War, again, if you studied British history, you'll see that there was a rise in socialism, an increase in socialist movements. The trade unions emerged as a result of that, and from that emerged the Labour Party, which is currently part of the political system in this country. After the First World War, the British government was calling the socialists as enemies of the state. Whether you want to label them in the contemporary language as terrorists, they consider them to be enemies of the state. So when it suits the West, when it suits a secular regime to label one organization as a terrorist, or another organization as an enemy of the state, or another organization as being an extremist movement, when it suits you, that's what you will do. When it suits you, you'll change your goalposts, start negotiating with the IRA, start negotiating with the PLO. Okay, because it serves the Western interest to do that. So your hypocrisy and double standards, okay, are coming out clearly. If it hasn't been made clear to other people, it's coming out clearly. So then he moved on and started to bring in this issue of the fact that Brother Abdul Wahid is a doctor, man. You're a GP in the NHS. Do you say this to your patients? Do your colleagues know what you think? Blah, 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 blah. Okay. let me make one thing clear to Piers Morgan and anybody else, okay, who's developed an unfair and unbalanced opinion about Dr. Abdul Wahid. I'm sat here in my scrubs, in my on-call room, as I was yesterday when I was watching that interview, and I've given 25, 26 years of service to the NHS. And let me tell you something very, very clearly. You're talking about this issue as if it's disgusting and despicable. How can you, as a doctor who's supposed to have a degree of care and concern for people, ethics, suddenly cannot find yourself condemning a terrorist act or a massacre like that happened on the 7th of October? How is it possible? Well, let me tell you something. How is it possible that there are doctors working in the NHS who glorify the genocide that has been committed, whether you like to call it genocide or not, because you're still sitting on the fence, okay? Whether that doctors in the NHS who are glorifying the genocide of the IDF and the Israeli state. Why don't you bring some of these doctors on and ask them, okay, the same question that you asked Dr. Abdul Wahid. How is it that you as an NHS doctor given 5 years of service or 25 years of service, okay, cannot come out and criticize the IDF? You cannot bring yourself to criticize what the Israeli state has done when it's killed 20,000 people, innocent. Okay, so I don't know what kind of bubble, Piers Morgan, you're living in, okay, to think that the whole of the NHS, okay, has in its entire workforce has got individuals, all of whom are sitting on one side of the fence, as if there's a unanimous position and a unanimous opinion on this subject matter. So the last point I want to address in this reaction video is again about the similar sort of issue that he was asking brother Dr. Abdul Wahid about, is about the LGBT issue and how he can look at himself in the mirror, when he's supposed to be a compassionate, empathetic individual working in the NHS for this many years. So I've talked about already, as you know, that there are, I would say, an equal number of doctors working in the NHS who actually would rather see all of the Palestinians, okay, in the sea right now. Okay, in my time working in the NHS, I've had enough discussions with pro-Israeli doctors, pro-Zionist doctors, who actually have no qualms and no hesitations to say openly that the whole of the Palestinian lands belong to Israel and we're going to take it all, and so on and so forth. Okay, so anyway, I've addressed that issue. I'm going to move on to the next topic that he raised, and it was raised in the same sort of context, and the context was, the issue of LGBT and so on and so forth. And he asked Dr. Abdul Wahid about his opinion on that. Again, before I go into that specific point, he'd be surprised. And again, I'll repeat the comment that I made about him living in a complete bubble, as if he thinks that everybody in this society supports that notion or supports that narrative of LGBT rights and LGBT equality. He's asking Dr. Abdul Wahid, if the gay and lesbian community under Sharia law will have equal rights when they don't have them here. Okay, forget what our Islamic position on the LGBT narrative is. Okay, they're peddling this notion, okay, and criticizing Muslims by saying that this gay community will not have equal rights under Islam. They don't have equal rights here. Okay, if women had equal rights in this society, feminism would become a dead issue. Okay, so it's a smokescreen. The question that he's asking is a red herring, really, because not that long ago, the transgender movement has been banned from participating in particular sports. So where's the equality there? So, you know, he can go on about this subject as much as he wants. He doesn't see it intentionally, or, you know, he's genuinely, he's blind and dumb, that he doesn't understand that there is a genuine disparity of rights and between genders here, between races, unfortunately, and so on and so forth. And he's got the audacity at the same time to ask brother Abdul Wahid about his position on homosexuality and the LGBT topic, when he has had guests on his show and he was ridiculing his transgender guests to such a point, okay, when he says, and he asked a rhetorical question to one of his guests and said, okay, so what if I want to identify as a black woman, when he clearly isn't, all right? And one of the other guests on the show was a black woman. She found that quite amusing. So, you know, he was being quite critical, and clearly he's got a problem with the LGBT narrative at some point in the spectrum of that narrative. Okay, he may be okay with homosexuality and lesbianism, okay, but he clearly has a problem, okay, with transgenderism. So he's now disingenuously asking brother Abdul Wahid this question. Okay. Further to this is he similarly wants to bring in the subject of him being a doctor with these anti-gay views. You know, how is it going to affect, you know, what do his colleagues and patients think about that? Well, I'm going to respond to that in a slightly different way to brother Abdul Wahid did. I've had, in my years as a doctor, I've had numerous discussions, okay, maybe not with patients, because like brother Abdul Wahid said, we don't have enough time to discuss life issues, okay, but with my colleagues, okay, whether they are male doctors or female doctors, female nurses or male nurses, you'd be surprised, okay, how many of them are not actually okay with the LGBT narrative being shoved down their throat, okay? And in the same way, they will treat patients from the LGBT community because they have what we call a duty of care. We doctors, Muslim doctors, do that too, because we have a duty of care. And although we have an Islamic position about homosexuality and LGBT, I'm going to go a little bit further and say this. You could have asked Abdul Wahid, what's the punishment in Islam? What does Sharia law say about homosexuality in Islam? And that, for you, I would consider that to be a rhetorical question, because you know and everybody else knows what Islam has to say. But that's not the context and the framework of the conversation. The context and the framework of the conversation is leading up to the next point about, do you want Sharia law in the UK? The implementation of Sharia law, the presence of the Quran and the Sunnah, okay, as a basis of legislation, wherever it is, whether it's in the Muslim world, whether it's in Europe or North America, will eradicate, okay, the economic problems that your secular politics has caused misery, which subsequently causes depression, subsequently causes suicide, okay, this uncertainty that women have about their position and their role in society in the face of a sexualized, misogynistic male population will eradicate all of these issues. And you've got the guile to say you don't want Sharia law in the UK. You don't realize how many of the problems, okay, the Sharia law will eradicate in Britain alone. Okay, so let me be clear on this point. I'm moving back to the subject of homosexuality and gender transformation and gender reassignment. There has been a over hyper sexualized liberalization of sexuality in this secularized West, Europe, North America, wherever it is. And it's led to the point that people have become confused, not just about their gender roles, but their gender identity. This is something with the Islamic culture, with Islamic rule and Islamic legislation, will eradicate this confusion and make it very, very clear what men are and what women are. And you know the difference yourself between a man and a woman. Okay, so clear way, the decisive way to address this issue is no, we're not necessarily going to kill all the gays and the lesbians and this and this. There is a problem that exists in the society, because we don't have an issue with the LGBT community as Muslims. We have problem with the adultery community. We have problems with, you know, couples who participate in husband swaps and wife swaps and all these ridiculous social experiments that you find so much satisfaction in pursuing as a society. All of these issues, okay, which subsequently leads to one problem after another, whether it's infidelity or whether it's confusion about one's sexuality. This is all a result of your secular liberal democracy, okay? And whether you want Sharia law in this country is irrelevant. You need it, okay? And that's my closing message to you. You and everybody else needs Sharia law in the West. So, those are my final remarks. And I will close by saying, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect my brother Dr. Abdul Wahid, okay, from any ills that people wish upon him. May good come from the interview that he gave. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring whatever is due to those who cause mischief in this world, whether it's through their weapons or whether it's through their tongues. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring this swiftly and rescue this ummah from all harm through the hands of the sincere believers when they raise their arms in dua and then fill those hands with their weapons. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.